Okay, so welcome to God Come Black, Afro-Atlantic Religious Systems and the Black Divine. My name is Omar Ramadan-Santiago, and I'm the current postdoctoral fellow in African and African American Studies, or AAAS, at Stanford University. In 1969, AAAS became the first ethnic studies program developed at Stanford University and the first African and African American Studies program at a private institution in the United States. It promotes an understanding of how history informs the present and inspires an engagement of the past in order to collectively dream of a more just and equitable future. And some very exciting news, starting in January 2024, it will become the Department of African and African American Studies. Before we begin, I wanted to thank our co-sponsors, the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity, Stanford Religious Studies, the Caribbean Studies Reading Group, and the Black Studies Collective. And I'm very excited about this panel. It gave me an opportunity to bring together some of my favorite Caribbeanist scholars. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion that we're having today. And I thank you all for taking the time to join me. I wanted to quickly address a couple points about the title of today's event. The first part, Will God Come Black, is actually pulled from a quote from Bob Marley. The full quote is, "What them want, a white God, will God come black?" And this quote, when I was doing my research for my dissertation, was a huge inspiration for this panel. I'm also using the phrase religious systems as opposed to religions to acknowledge that a number of adherents understand their beliefs being more accurately described as a way of life as opposed to an institutionalized religion. I'm very excited about this panel, so I'm going to ask you each to introduce yourselves and give us a brief introduction to the religious system that you'll be discussing today. Anyone, I'll call. Rachel, go first.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you so much, Omar, for having us. I'm really excited about this panel. My name is Rachel Cantave, or Rachel Cantave. I am an anthropologist based out of Skidmore College, and my research looks at religious and racial identity in northeastern Brazil, specifically Salvador da Bahia. And today I'll be talking about Candomblé. Interestingly, I look at religion comparatively. So I don't actually only study Candomblé. I also study Afro-Brazilian Catholics and Afro-Brazilian Neo-Pentecostals or evangelicals. But I comparatively look at their experience of racial identity and community values and sort of how different religious, Afro-Brazilian religious institutions and people work together to deal with community and neighborhood issues. And today I'll be talking about specifically Candomblé. So Candomblé is an African-derived religion, African diasporic religion. Some people say Africana religion. I'll specifically talk about it as being an Afro-Brazilian religion today. It's kind of hard to sum up Candomblé because there is a lot of variation in practices, and Candomblé is sort of part of a larger Afro-Brazilian spiritual systems all over Brazil that includes Umbanda and Kimbanda as well. Candomblé is often perceived to be perhaps the most African or traditional of these Afro-Brazilian systems. Most of the Afro-Brazilian religions have gone through processes of syncretism through enslavement, sort of out of necessity, but have either continued with that syncretic practice or not in contemporary times. And we can talk about that a little bit more as well later today. And I'm trying to think what else needs to be noted. Candomblé is monotheistic in that practitioners believe in a God, one God who is not invested in human, right, activities as much, and worship orishas as being these intermediary divinities that are between human experience and God. And specifically today, I'll be talking more so about Candomblé of the Nago tradition, which is perhaps you could say more Yoruba derived tradition, because that's where I do my ethnographic research. Trying to think if there's anything else I've missed, but I'm sure we can come back to it later.
Thank you so much. Savi, do you want to speak?
Yeah, I'm Savi Luis Burgos. I'm a PhD student here at Stanford University. I want to say thank you, Omar, for inviting me here. It's an honor to be in a room with incredible scholars doing incredible work. And so very much thank you. I'm very humbled to be here. I study La Regla Ocha. I'm also a devotee of La Regla Ocha. It's also known as Lukumi or Santeria. I'm also looking at other Afro-Atlantic religions and traditions within the Caribbean and its Caribbean diasporas in the US. But I'm primarily focused on La Regla Ocha. And I prefer the term La Regla Ocha, both personally, but also in terms of the work that I'm doing, because it really describes some of how devotees feel about the traditions, like the rules of Ocha. And so when people initiate into these traditions under the priesthood of the Orisha, the divinities are described by Dr. Cantave, they receive all these rules, right? These ideas of how to navigate the world now as a priest, right? And some of them include ideas around what to eat, what not to eat, right? How to have, what type of relationships to have with people, what type of relationships to have with the world, with nature, with divinities, in which you initiate under, because you receive like a mother and a father, but it's like one Orisha, that's your main titular Orisha, but also your relationship with other Orisha and the messages they have for you as well. And so it's considered a tradition in which there are a lot of rules and regulations to abide by, not just as like general devotees, but also by priests. It's described as an Afro-Cuban tradition because it was preserved and transformed in Cuba. Obviously, it's spread throughout the different parts of the Caribbean, and there's different traditions and variations of those traditions in different Caribbean spaces. And so, for example, in Espiritismo in Puerto Rico, which my great-grandparents were devotees of, as well as like their parents and henceforth, you have the invocation of particular Orisha, but it's really focused like on the dead and other spirits and spirit guides, but the Orisha are there. So it talks to the ways of which these traditions transform in other parts, but as it's called by devotees, as a complete system, it was preserved in this way in Cuba and therefore throughout the Caribbean and the diaspora. So you find many folks who are not Cuban in these traditions, but still acknowledge and recognize that Cuba is like the kind of like the wellspring of these traditions outside of Africa. And so Africa is considered that, but it's also Cuba, and particular parts of Cuba, La Habana, Matanzas, which those systems that were preserved and transformed there are the ones in which like those lineages that people are part of in diaspora. And I mean like the United States, Spain, and other parts of the Caribbean, which has a large Caribbean population, Spain and the United States. Those lineages really come from La Habana and Matanzas, and then some in Oriente, the southern provinces, like Santiago de Cuba. You'll find folks from there, but mostly the devotees and lineages from those two areas. But it's considered an Afro-Cuban tradition. And again, Afro, and I'll speak more about that, is like very essential part of it. So you have devotees who are not Cuban, but also wouldn't consider themselves Black, but still like honor like the African essence and histories and legacies of these traditions.
So much. Kyrah?
Good evening, bonsoir tout le monde. This is such an honor to be joining this esteemed panel, and I have to say a special shout out, one, because this is my alma mater institution, so I'm happy to be joining, and two, very importantly, I remember once upon a time when I was part of a panel during my undergraduate years as part of the Caribbean Students Association, and we put on a panel very much like this one to gather together Afro-Caribbean scholars, and now I'm on the other side, and so thank you to Dr. Ramadan-Santiago for inviting us to join. Shout out CSA. Ow. My name is Dr. Kyrah Malika Daniels. I am a scholar practitioner of Haitian Vodou. And Haitian Vodou is a tradition that is an African-derived heritage system of Haiti. It is a tradition with multiple African lineages, but we identify three primary lineages of Congo traditions of Central Africa, Yoruba traditions of Nigeria, and Fon traditions or Dahomian traditions of Benin. And these three different lineages have greatly impacted the development and the evolution of Haitian Vodou today. I should note that there are differences between Northern and Southern Vodou. In the North, you have systems that are much more akin actually to Brazilian Candomblé, in the sense that there are different houses that honor different particular cultural lineages from the African continent, Nago and Congo and Dahomean lineages or Gada lineages, even though they serve all of the spirits. But you have more of a system akin to Candomblé, whereas in the South, each temple is supposed to serve all 21, and there isn't the same sort of intentionality behind one particular tradition. In the Vodou tradition, as Dr. Cantave and also as Mr. Burgos were explaining, it is very much oriented towards an umbrella system in which you have a high creator, or Logum, or Bon Dieu. You have intermediary spirits known as Loi, sometimes referred to as mystère, the mysteries. You have other intermediary spirits who are ancestral, the ancestors, and you have humans and the animals and the plants that animate the world as we know it. I think that one of the things that will be a really central component of our discussion today is talking about religious racism, which is something that I know Dr. Cantave is an expert on. And so I look forward to returning to that so we can discuss the implications of how we centralize discussions of Blackness and Africanness in these traditions. So thank you, and looking forward to the dialogue.
Charles, if you'd like to finish us up.
Sure, thank you. So, greetings, everyone. My name is Charles Price. I am a faculty member in the College of Education and Human Development at Temple University. I'll be at the University of North Carolina beginning January. And so my general research interest is identity. And that's at both the individual and the collective level. And that theme kind of suffuses everything else that I do. So some of the other areas of interest that I have are social movements. Life narratives are one way that I use to understand identity formation at the individual and collective level. I have some background in community organizing, and I have an ongoing interest there, but also in doing action research, kind of working with communities to do action research. So that's kind of like my background in terms of my research interests. And I'll be talking to you this evening about the Rastafari of Jamaica, but also of the world now, of the 6 continents, as it goes so much. And so when we talk about Rastafari, we're talking about a religio-racial complex that is both racial and religious, and you can't separate the two. I'm going to use your term, religious system, Omar. I think that's an apt way to describe it. And at the center of that religious system, that religio-racial system, is I won't say belief, but the claim that Emperor Selassie, the Emperor Haile Selassie I, the 225th Emperor of Ethiopia, is the Messiah return, spoken of in the book of Revelations in the King James Bible, and that the emperor came to redeem all Black people, but not only Black people, but all people. So in a nutshell, that is sort of where God is Black fits in here and what I'll be talking about over the course of the evening. So I'm looking forward to this.
Thank you all so much. Again, just a reminder for the attendees, feel free to leave any questions in the Q&A section. I believe there's also there is a chat section as well in case there's some discussion or something that you would like to include. I believe that even in the webinar format, it still should work. And yeah, that's good. It does not work.
I think the chat is disabled for now.
Okay. Well, I got your chat, so I think, oh, it's only, okay, the chat is just between us, sorry. So everyone else can chat in the Q&A section. But yeah, let us know if you have any questions, and after we have our discussion, I'll invite some of you to join, or if you want, read your questions out, and yeah. So let's get right into it. Also for the panelists, again, I'll be asking questions, but just everyone speak up. I want it to be more of a discussion-based conversation. So the first question, how do you define Black and Blackness? And when you think about how historically certain groups have interpreted the Christian biblical concepts of the mark of Cain, or the curse of Ham as darker Black skin, how is Blackness understood within the religious systems that you're speaking about today?
Should we just jump in?
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So I think there are two things I'd like to start this conversation with. One is, first of all, this is a difficult question. And I think it depends really for me, different people that I've worked with who are practitioners of Candomblé might say different things. But one thing is that for Candomblé, Blackness has to do with African heritage, right? Because Candomblé comes to Brazil through the transatlantic slave trade, and there's no amount of syncretism that can remove that from these religious traditions, Candomblé, Umbanda, and Kimbanda, right? And thinking about religious racism, thinking about this racism that specifically is targeted at the povos de santo, or people who practice Candomblé, Umbanda, and Kimbanda, right? That in and of itself is an evidence of how these religions are racialized as Black contemporaneously. And there's no way out of that, even using saints as guises for orishas. The second way I think Blackness is maybe defined through Candomblé is in a stance that is resistant to Eurocentrism or anti-colonial, anti-capitalist, perhaps even for some temples, queer, anti-misogynist, especially in Brazil. Because Brazil is one of the places where you find the temples, many women are the head of temples. So there are ways that Candomblé has been thought of as being a more matriarchal form of a Yoruba-derived African tradition in the Americas than perhaps in other places. And I'm sure Savi can speak a little bit more about that, perhaps in Cuba and Puerto Rico. I don't know if it's different. So I think Candomblé and its Blackness is sort of defined in relation to being about resistance and resilience in the face of all of these different types of hegemonic power over time. And obviously there's a lot of variation, like I said, between temples, between different practices, but I think that kind of worldview, that kind of politic is also why we see so much intolerance and violence against these practices in present day Brazil.
So I'll go second. So I'm going to give you a kind of general definition of Blackness, sort of the overarching framework that I work with. So one, I think about Blackness as a state or a condition or a feature of being Black. And this pertains to African and African descended people. And it pertains to them in two ways. One, those who self-identify as Black, but also those people who are identified as Black by other people. And sometimes those two things are not synonymous, all right? Someone may not identify as Black, but you're treated as if you are Black. And so Blackness encompasses race as a category. It encompasses racialization as a process. It encompasses racial identity in terms of how people self-identify and identify by others. And it also encompasses racism. That is the prejudicial treatment toward people who identify as or are identified by others as Black. And that it involves a range of states and conditions that have a lot to do with how people interpret, how they embody, how they enact race knowledge. And that this embodiment, this enactment is someone is shaped by their cultural frameworks and practices that include things like language, that includes things like speech, ethnicity, ideas and beliefs that people have about things like a homeland or notions of blood, notions of lineage or collective memory. And so there are a range of cultural frameworks that fit within this kind of broad encompassing category of Blackness. And I'll sort of close it out by saying that Blackness, there are competing notions of what it means to be Black and what Blackness means. And so that there's no agreement on what it means to be Black and what Blackness means. So we should expect competing notions of Blackness and being Black.
Yeah, this is a very hard question. I'm just thinking, and I love the affirmation of a politicized connection to Black identity, right? And so like you look at the histories of the transition into using Black, right? It's about these movements for Black self-determination, right? About like having an internal dialogue to develop an identity, a cohesive identity, or close to a cohesive identity, because there's always disagreements, there's always an internal dialogue that was referenced. But to approach that, so to fight injustices, to fight oppression, also this I'm thinking a lot about this connection to diaspora, Blackness, and indigeneity. What is the relationship that Black folks have to land, to geographic space? And I think that's also part of developing an idea of Blackness, because in the 1960s and 70s in the US, you have this thesis around internal colonialism, like these conditions of colonialism within the so-called first world, right? And so you have folks evoke, well, Bed-Stuy in Brooklyn, right? Harlem in New York City. You have the Black metropolis on the South Side in Chicago. And so again, like what are the conditions that Black folks are living in this space? What's the relationship of Black folks in this space? And how could we organize as a self-conscious people, but also a self-conscious people within a specific space? And I think that's what like how folks were attracted to these traditions, since they're Orisha or divinities that live in nature. And so since they live in nature, it's like we have to really reflect on the ways in which we have a relationship to nature, how that has been disrupted by colonialism, has been disrupted by enslavement and forced migration and different periods of forced migration, right? So I'm speaking about communities in which I've lived in which folks also can talk about origins in different spaces in the US, the Caribbean, and in Africa. Right. And so like we've constantly been dislocated, but the idea is that the Risha are everywhere and they follow us. And so when folks were enslaved and forced across the Atlantic, in terms of the oral history of these traditions, and I'm thinking specifically again, Lukumio, La Regla de Ocha, people were praying to Yamaya, the divinity of a river, the River Ogun in Yoruba land, right? But she became synchronized with the ocean and diaspora because of that collective memory of, we pray to her because she's a Orisha that takes away the sadness, right? She's a great mother. And so we were praying for her. And so through the ocean, we're able to survive because of praying to Yamaya. And so again, like this relationship to land, geographic space, this political identity around self-determination, around mutual aid. La Regla de Ocha was developed in Cuba because of Cabildos de Nación, I'm sorry. I also went to Brazil this summer, so I'm like thinking in both Portuguese, Spanish, and English. So I was speaking mostly in Spanish in Brazil. But yeah, so like these Cabildos de Nación, right? And so that was used by the colonial apparatus as a way to try to control the different African groups coming into Cuba, or being forced to go to Cuba, and as well as like to divide and agitate the historical grievances that folks had with each other from different empires and city-states and communities in Africa. But they were the centers of community. They were the centers of the preservation and transformation of these traditions. They were the centers of mutual aid, of helping folks escape enslavement, right? Helping folks to buy papers for people to be free. And then also you have the Maroon Society. So these traditions also developed in Maroon societies in Cuba and throughout the diaspora, as well as the United States. We don't really include the US and Maroon communities on conversations about Maroon communities, but that's also important. Again, this relationship to land, to space, to refuge, of mutual aid. And so I see Blackness as that. And I think these traditions is one way, one focal point to understand the politicized aspect of these identities and identity formation.
Oh, I love going last. I get to learn from all of you in this comparative context. So I think that there are some really important resonances here with how Blackness is defined in the context of Haiti and in the context of Vodou, and also some really interesting distinctions. I think one thing that Rachel and Zabi are pointing out is that in the context of Brazil, in Cuba and Puerto Rico, and even we can add the Dominican Republic, Blackness is hotly contested by a lot of population members, even of these African-derived communities, right? It's something that's at times used derogatively. It's something at times that people claim proudly, even when they're light brights like me, right? Like there are all of these difficult negotiations of Blackness and skin color. I think Haiti and Jamaica are quite distinct in this way. It's a lot harder in Haiti to try to make claims about one's distance, historically speaking, to an African identity. That doesn't mean that people don't try to distance themselves from the Africanness of Vodou. I think, though, it's harder to distance oneself from the identity as a Black person or as a Black citizen. But I think to answer this question, we actually have to go back. We got to go way, way back, because in 1791, August 14th, we have the hosting of the Wakaima ceremony. Some people say it's really like a Pan-African association, a congregation, a gathering of nations of multiple African lineages. And in this context, you have the gathering not only of enslaved peoples of African descent from the continent, those who are Creoles born in the colony of Saint-Domingue, and you have Maroons. So just as Zabi was pointing out, you have a long legacy of Maroons. This is true in Jamaica, this is true in Cuba, this is true in Haiti, this is true in Brazil, of people who self-emancipated, who ran away into the mountains, who ran away into the marshes, created self-governing autonomous societies as Black peoples, as Black citizens. Blackness was now being claimed not in the language of Blackness, but in the sense of we are autonomous African peoples. And something really remarkable happens, which is that this, enslaved peoples, maroon peoples, and free people of color all unite to fight against the French. And then in 1803, Napoleon is losing, and it's very evident that he's losing the war for Haiti's independence. And so he conscripts European soldiers, specifically coming from nations like Poland. So Polish soldiers are brought to Saint-Domingue, and some of them look around and realize, hold up, this situation is an awful lot like what we're experiencing in terms of our own European colonization as a small nation in Europe. And so many Polish soldiers deserted the French army, joined cahoots, if you will, with African descendants and fought for their freedom. And in the Constitution that was ratified in 1804, Emperor Jean-Jacques Dessalines includes a component that indicates that not only is Haiti now a free and Black republic, but that anyone who fought for Haiti's liberation would be regarded as a citizen of the new nation and as a Black subject in the republic. That's profound. These white Polish folks became Black overnight. Right. And so in our conceptions of Blackness, I think that actually in the superstructure of the political formation and in the cosmological orientation, there's always been room for everyone is Black, even if we don't all look the same. That's reflected in our pantheon. Our pantheon is a pantheon of all Black, all African spirits, some of whom are light skinned, some of whom are brown skinned, some of whom are dark skinned, and all are regarded as Black. Oh, and then very quickly, I see that we have some exciting questions in the chat. So I'm just going to take this opportunity to answer one of them from Alexandra Saint-Élien, bienvenue, bienvenue, who asks whether there are taboos in Haitian Vodou. And I imagine that she herself might have some knowledge and wisdom to share about that. But from my understanding, this is actually something that I think we lost in Haitian Vodou. I think it's something that really persisted in the Yoruba traditions of the African diaspora, particularly in places like Brazil and in Cuba. But it's not something that I have found on an individual level. I have found that houses sometimes will give taboos, part of reglement, part of ritual order, which is what Zabi was talking about with Regla de Ocha. But there are more house-specific taboos. And I think that that's fascinating, but I think that it was yet another way that Haitian Vodouisans or Vodouvi, devotees of the tradition, were sort of organizing themselves by community rather than having the individualistic components that were still remembered in the Yoruba traditions. But I'd be fascinated to hear other people's thoughts.
So Omar, I realized that I didn't answer your second question, which was about ham, right?
Yes.
It's that one, right? So for the Rastas, the first two generations for sure were very sensitive to the condemnation of Blackness in the King James Version of the Bible, but they reworked it in a way that made Ham and the condemnation a minor point, and that made Japheth and Shem major points as oppressor, Japheth in particular representing Europe, right? So as Ethiopians and Black Africans, any notion of there being a curse on Black people was negated by their call and their recognition of being special and chosen people. So in a way, they kind of reworked that understanding of Ham and the condemnation of Blackness in the Bible.
And thank you so much for bringing that up. And a big part of why I wanted to ask that question was just how Blackness is sort of discussed in different religious systems. And, you know, from you have one where it's almost seen as like a curse, to you have another where literally the divine are portrayed this way. I wanted to really explore that further. That does lead me to the next question, which is...
Can I jump in there quickly? Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely.
No, because I wanted to go back. I realized after the fact that I didn't address that either. And I think that Dr. Daniels left us with a really beautiful segue, which is how the curse of Ham lives on through, like, I call it the mythic Blackness of Haiti. And, you know, you see that after the earthquake when evangelical pastors start saying, right, this is the curse. This is the curse that Haitians, the voodoo curse that Haitians like made a pact with the devil. And that's why these terrible things keep happening, right, in the nation. And so there is a way that that not a way, absolutely people who practice African traditional religions in the Americas are constantly combating that sort of rhetoric and discourse, especially now with the kind of increase in violent intolerance, specifically coming from evangelical and neo-Pentecostal groups in Haiti, in Brazil, in all these different places around the Americas. And so from the other angle, it's been interesting to study and work with Black neo-Pentecostals in Brazil, who also have to sort of deal with, right? Like, what is this idea of like Black sin, or that there's this disconnect between a white God and Black Christians? And it seems like many of the people I've worked with are sort of trying to create this cohesion between a Christian God and Christian values and their Blackness, because Blackness in Brazil, right, is really framed through the experience of enslavement. So there's no way to get away from this curse, right, or the way that Black people have been, or Africans have been punished through enslavement, right? So I think it's an interesting question, and I wanted to just tie that back into some of the religious racism that we see happening today, that's saying, right, like these religious systems are cursed. And also saying that they're bad for society.
You so much. And also a reminder to the attendees, feel free to leave your questions in the Q&A section. We'll be looking at those as we speak, and people are welcome to, if there's a question that you particularly want to answer from the chat, feel free. You know, it's good. And also one of the questions is being recorded. It is, and we'll let you know where it will be posted afterwards. So the next question, depictions of the divine can be incredibly powerful and symbolic, even at times quite political. How is the divine portrayed in the religious system that you are discussing? And what does it mean for practitioners and adherents to worship divinities that are understood and or depicted as Black? And feel free if you have a certain depiction of a divinity that you'd like to share.
So I'll get it started. So you're right that the depictions are powerful, they're symbolic, and in the case of Rastafari, very, very political. So for one, Emperor Selassie provided a framework and a person to connect Black Jamaicans to the ancient biblical past, to connect Black Jamaicans to a longstanding Black ideology of Ethiopianism, all right? And in Ethiopianism, for instance, the idea of Black people being Israelites reincarnated existed long before the Rastas, all right? That part of the experience of Black people was that they were chosen by God, they would be protected by God, and that they would be returned home by God, that they were out in the wilderness, oppressed under the capitalist North American equivalent of, or Caribbean equivalent of Pharaoh. So it also allowed Black folk to connect themselves to that ancient biblical lineage of King David, King Solomon, Queen Sheba. So it provided Black folk a way to connect themselves to basically a biblical lineage that was constructed as white. The emperor was adored by the world for a while, you know, probably into the 1940s, all right, but also adored by Black folk long before the Rastas. So there was a connection between the emperor, Ethiopia, and Black people of the diaspora that predated the Rastas, but the Rastas sort of connected to as well. You can see this in a number of ways. So you can look at publications like National Geographic, 1930, Time Magazine, 1930. You can look at the national newspaper of Jamaica, the Daily Gleaner, or the major weekly, the Jamaica Times, that the emperor was really of interest, of central interest to many segments of Jamaican society and the wider world. So these depictions of the emperor were incredibly powerful, and they became incredibly political. And we can talk about the political parts as we get into the discussion. And I have an image here, if I can share it with you. Sure, okay, let's see if I can find this. All right, so this, can you see it? Can you see Secret Society to Destroy Whites?
Yes.
Okay. So this was published in 1930 in the major Jamaican weekly, the Jamaica Times. Now the title here is The Secret Society to Destroy Whites. You see a picture of the emperor there and his regalia, and you see the subtext says, reported to be existing with headquarters in Abyssinia, Ethiopia, with an army of 20 million people. Now this article was first published in Austria in 1935, basically what translated into English is the New Viennese Time. And it's a piece of Italian propaganda developed by the fascists, the Italian fascists, to frighten Italians first and foremost, right? That Black people were going to take over Europe, and they were led by Emperor Haile Selassie, all right? And that they had this elaborate system set up where it says an army of 20 million. There were actually 400 million Black people under this secret society called Nyabengi. So these ideas were really circulating in the early 1930s, and the early Rastas caught on to this, and they latched onto it, and they sort of integrated these ideas into their own belief system. So the major Rastafari house is known as the House of Nyabengi. And right here, Nyabengi is what this pseudonym author, Federico Falos, is saying is what the world white people should be afraid of. All right, so how do I close this now? Stop share. Okay, good.
Everyone else, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, so I prepared some pictures, but I guess what I want to say in relation to this question is that representations of the Orixás in Brazil can be quite powerful, certainly symbolic, but also quite ubiquitous for many reasons. So just ever present, right? And much of that has to do with tourism, with how Afro-Brazilian religion has been incorporated into Afro-Brazilian heritage tourism. And so let me share my screen and give you some examples. And I just was thinking about how are they represented in public space and what are some examples I might give you all. Share screen. One second.
if you have a lot of windows open, it's hard to find what you want, right?
Yeah, exactly. Here it is. So you're looking at first in an installation in Salvador da Bahia called Jiki do Tororo.
That's incredible.
And yeah,
It
it is
is.
beautiful. These are statues of orishas that were erected in 1998. There was a lot of contestation around the erection of these statues created by Tatsi Moreno. Behind in this picture, I don't know if you can see my cursor here. Can you?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's actually the new stadium that was built for the most recent World Cup that was in Brazil. That was 2015, I think. 2016. So just to give you a sense of like the magnitude and also how it's at a center touristic part of Salvador. You might also see orishas on murals, on walls. It's something you pass very easily in Salvador, a creation of, in this case, Oshun, right? On a wall somewhere. You also find orishas in a lot of popular music in Brazil. So on the top right, you're seeing a picture from the 2022 Carnival, where one of the samba schools in Rio, their theme was sort of pushing back against religious intolerance and upholding Afro-Brazilian religion. They won the competition. I don't know how many of you know about Rio Carnival, Brazilian Carnival, but it's a competition between the samba schools, and whoever puts on the most beautiful, spectacular performance wins. They won that year, and you're seeing Oxóssi here, the Orisha Oxóssi in front here. There's also lots of representations in music. We don't have time for me to show you this video, but I also want to draw your attention to this bottom left corner, where you're seeing the album art for a rapper slash singer called Baku Eshu do Blues, which I recommend if any of you are interested in Brazilian music. His music is really dope. His videos are amazing. And he had an album called Eshu, and notice what he did there, right? That's Jesus. He crosses out the S and the J and adds the accent and has Eshu. So you find the orishas represented in music. Most recently, I wanted to bring this to our conversation because you actually do not see this a lot. Orishas have showed up now in sport. This is Paulinho. He's a very popular Brazilian soccer player who has openly admitted and posts online about being a povo de santo, practicing candomblé. That's a picture of him and his mother holding a statue of Iemanjá. And he also has Ashe tattooed on his stomach. And I think it's interesting because when you think about all of the Christian symbols in soccer, right? As soon as someone scores a goal, they cross themselves, they point up at God. And it was a huge reveal and story when he ripped off his shirt and he had Ashe written on his chest. And again, think about Brazil's been dominating in soccer for how long? But we don't know any other that come to mind for me, soccer stars who have openly talked about being practitioners of candomblé or any other Afro-Brazilian religion. And then very recently, we've seen orishas show up in children's literature in Brazil as well. So this is a comic book superhero based on the orishas. You see Xangô here in the middle, right? Drawn in sort of comic book fashion. And so I wanted to bring all these examples of how orishas are quite ubiquitous. You find them everywhere in Brazil in many different art forms, but also that I think is part of what drives a lot of religious racism. I'm going to stop share quickly because it seems like more people, like there's more prominence and more people perhaps practicing candomblé than there actually are. In the latest Brazilian census reportings, there's only about 3% of the population that admits, and that's a special word, admits or self-identifies as practitioners of candomblé, perhaps more than that, most probably more than that. But there's this way in which they show up everywhere because of tourism. They show up everywhere because it's considered a part of Brazilian heritage, the way that many, and we can talk about this later, white and light-skinned Brazilians can also access Afro-Brazilian heritage through like dabbling in Orisha worship or proximity, we might call it, Orisha proximity. But also the ubiquitousness allows for a lot of violence against Afro-Brazilian religions and practitioners as well.
Really quick, was the soccer player faced with any kind of criticism when he had such a proud display? Because it's interesting because other religious practice, I'm sure they're like, no, of course. Like, but so it'll be interesting the dynamic that he did face some backlash.
Yeah, there was lots of online backlash. And again, that's why in my work, I talk about how secularism is often really just Christian supremacy. Because we accept, right, Christian symbols on the soccer field, on the soccer pitch. We don't think twice about it. But as soon as someone has Ashe written on their chest, then it's problematic. Then why are you bringing religion into sport?
Ooh, that's a word right there. Secularism is really just Christian supremacy. That's a mic drop. Thank you, Dr. Cantave, for that. I want to respond and just say that I do wish that the full chat were live, but y'all are really, I think, engaged in this Q&A. And so thank you for your engagement. I want to try to answer a few questions as we're answering the question that Dr. Ramadan-Santiago just posed to us. First, shout out to Colin Edouard for your question on sonic traditions. I have to be honest, I think I'm going to have to consider a little bit more about what it would look like to imagine Blackness embedded in sonic traditions. The most obvious thing that comes to mind is that, what differentiates our music and our devotional music is polyrhythms, right? And I actually think that that's very racialized because when Europeans first traveled to the African continent and heard the polyrhythms that, the head is doing this and the core body is doing this and the legs are doing this and the arms are doing this and 7 different rhythms are happening simultaneously, they heard noise. They heard cacophony and they called it as such, and they called it primitive music, right? And in fact, what's remarkable is that these were uninitiated ears, right? They actually weren't sophisticated enough to be able to discern all of those different rhythms that were being played and danced to simultaneously. So that's my best attempt, if you will, at thinking about Blackness and the sonic scape. But I know that this is your realm of specialty. A lot of you posed some really important questions about Christianity, and I think that that's actually a great way to segue into my response to this larger question, which is that we have to think about the relationship of Christianity and colonialism as an ongoing practice of the denigration of Blackness, the demonization of Africanness. So this is something that Dr. Diane Stewart refers to as Afrophobia. If you are interested, you can check out her book, 3 Eyes for the Journey. And also Dr. Marcus Harvey has a really great text, or a really great TED Talk, I should say, on Africanity and Afrophobia that you should check out. But he and Dr. Stewart identify that Afrophobia is the wild and irrational fear and hatred of all that is African. I'm going to say that again, y'all. Afrophobia is the wild and irrational fear and hatred of all that is African. And unfortunately, that has become deeply internalized in the context of the African continent, as well as in the African diaspora, because of colonial education, because of missionization. And so when we talk about images and representations of Blackness as divine, I think it's really helpful to talk about these different representations, because in Haiti, I wish we had beautiful statues of the Loa. That would not hold in Haiti, not in 2023, right? And I know that they've been attacked multiple times. I know that murals have been covered up, but we don't even get that. We don't even get murals. We don't even get public monuments, right? So representations are really more personal artistry. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and I want to point out some really interesting representations of these different examples of Black divine, and specifically the Black feminine divine. Can everybody see my screen? Okay, awesome. So I think what's fascinating is that the most common representation on many Haitian altars is that of the saints. I imagine that this is true in the context of Cuba, in the context of Brazil, and in the context of Puerto Rico. And that's really significant because these saints are white. right? So the representation here that we have of Mater Dolorosa is our association with Il Judifreda, goddess of love, fortune, abundance. She's a woman. We have La Virgen de la Caridad del Cobre, who is represented as La Sirena. And here I'm going to note that this is the patroness saint of Cuba. And there are racial implications there. You have a boat that is supposed to be emblematic of the different racial lineages of Cuba. You have somebody who's supposed to be African, who ain't doing nothing on this capsizing boat besides looking very, coonish. Then you have a figure who's supposed to represent the indigenous American heritage and the European heritage. And the idea is La Virgen is supposed to protect all of these different races of Cuba. So we have the same icon in Haiti that's associated with La Sirène, the mermaid queen spirit. Our only saint that really gets portrayed as an African person is Our Lady of Czestochowa, and I'm so glad that we had an opportunity to speak briefly about Polish descendants. We have an understanding that this is a Polish Black Madonna. There are a lot of different speculations about why she may have been African from the first place in the context of Poland, but regardless, she was brought over with Polish troops and has become revered as our example of El Girato. So when we talk about different representations of Black divine, and specifically I'll talk about the Black feminine divine, it's only in really artist renderings that you get to see Black divinities in Haitian Vodou. And that to me is a shame. It is wonderful that artists have the freedom to imagine and to envision them as Black and as variations of Blackness. So you have El Frida, who's a little bit lighter skinned. You have La Sirène, who's sort of brown skinned. You have El Dantor, who is the warrior mother, who is dark skinned. Gun Brigitte, who perhaps is in between brown skin and dark skin. You have these, but that's only within the purview of individual artists. Unfortunately, that's not something that you get a chance to see in the context of public representations of these African spirits, though everyone agrees they're African. And I think that that's something that we have to unpack because, there are a lot of conversations of, should we extricate this Catholicism? Should we remove all Catholic saints on the altars? And, here I have to defer to my elders. I am not going to speak to any Tatsi, any auntie, any uncle, and tell them that they need to remove this white saint from their altar because they see the saints and they see their Black divinities. So it is not my business to tell an elder how they should worship. What I do feel like is my responsibility is making sure that we see more representations of these spirits, because I guarantee you the new generation, millennials, Gen Z, these are the types of images that we're gravitating towards. There is an artist on Instagram known as Vodou Renaissance. There are artists such as Stephen Hamilton, Vladimir Sibyl Charlier, artists such as Musa Harar, who are portraying Black spirits as African spirits. That's where I think the new excitement is coming in, but I don't think it's my job to tell an elder who they can or cannot worship as their representation of the divine.
I find it fascinating the ways in which the Orisha are depicted in Lukumi, right? And it depends on how much folks are invoking the synchronization of the Orisha. So for example, you have Babaluaye or Asohano, which is a Dahomey divinity that's incorporated within Yoruba land that was synchronized with San Lazaro. And one of the reasons why he was depicted as and synchronized as San Lazaro, because Saint Lazarus was known to be in the Bible to be ill and be resurrected from the dead, right? And Asohano is the divinity of disease and health, right? And so he is depicted as having leprosy, right, in terms of the oral traditions. And so Asohano became San Lazaro, and folks within these traditions still speak, they don't speak Asohano's name, they speak San Lazaro's name. Again, he was synchronized with that, but also because he invokes so much fear. So it's like, let's not say his name. He has multiple names, so let's not say his name. And so it becomes San Lazaro, and then therefore the depictions are consistently this white man with leprosy and a dog, right? But then you have Oshun is usually depicted as someone who's mulatto, right? Or mixed race, right? Still adjacent to Blackness and engaging with Blackness, and also engaging with the histories of enslavement and intermarriage and sexual abuse, right? And so it's also invoking these histories when we're talking about that, because she's also known as a divinity Yamayan, her sister. Yamaya is the great mother. She's also known as someone who's a mother as well, a divinity of fertility, a divinity who loves children, a divinity who's really focused on survival. Sometimes we overplay this idea that she's connected to love. She is, but she's also about survival. What will my children do to survive in this new world? So it's also invoking those histories, while it's also problematic, right? And there's a lot of conversations and debate within these traditions and these communities, right? There's not one, there's consistent dialogue. There's not one perception that overrides the rest, right? And so when you have folks like Beyonce and Jay-Z and the community folks, like my mother says this, she's like, they went to Cuba and they initiated it, right? Initiated to Oshun and initiated to Chango, right? And Chango is usually depicted and he's synchronized with Santa Barbara, right? A woman's saint, right? But he's usually depicted online. And my reference point is a lot within the community, but also online. What are people sharing? What are these like Lukumi communities sharing to depict and to humanize the Orisha? They usually depict everyone as Black. It's usually Oshun as the mulatto and San Lazaro as a white saint, right? But everyone else is Black. And what's more interesting for me is how they invoke their engagement with land and space, right? And nature. So when Elegba is depicted, he's understood to be the divinity of the crossroads, right? He exists everywhere simultaneously. He also is a divinity in which you are, when you want to speak to the spirits or engage with the spirit world or the other world, you have to go through him, right? He's also a patron of children and is understood as a trickster. So he's usually depicted as a Black child, right? But also as a stone, because when you receive the Orisha, the sacred items of the Orisha, for Elegba, it is the stone. And so it's also speaking, and he lives in the stone in the forest, right? And so it's also depicting the Orisha as elements of nature. So it's not only as humans, but nature as well. And so that goes back to Beyonce and Jay-Z. And so I'm like, what? To my mother, why Oshun, why Chango, right? And so again, like the ways in which Chango is represented and invoked in stories, the former emperor Alafin of the Oyo Empire, a man of great virility, right? Oshun the Mulata. And they may very well, again, be their children, right? And so understood as all being children of the Orisha. And you know that for sure when you're about to initiate which Orisha is your titular Orisha. But also, when the Orisha come down in ceremony, and this is one of the reasons why these traditions are so demonized, right? So much of the messages we have received has been a demonization of these traditions and the ways in which they see the world, their worldviews, right? So in this worldview, having spirits and divinities come into a human body to give messages to the community is seen as a natural part of being a part of this world, right? Like the world in which these Orisha and divinities live in, that world can coalesce into this world through ceremony. And so the Orisha and the divine is also depicted as something very personal and interconnected to the everyday. So through these ceremonies, you're speaking to the Orisha and the Orisha is speaking to you. And particularly with the Nukumi, because I've gone to Candomblé ceremonies and the Orisha are known to speak less to people, right? And with the Nukumi, they're very, very much speaking to you all the time. And depending on the context of that ceremony, depending on the social, political, and economic context of that community, you'll have the Orisha speak to almost everybody there. I saw a Yemaya ceremony, which she spoke to 100 people. When I also saw her in that other ceremony of the same Ile or Casa de Santo, or sacred house, she spoke to a few people that she needed to be spoken to, right? So, but that context was post-pandemic or around the pandemic, right? And so you also have the depiction of the divine as being something very personal. And so you may have this understanding of Oshun being a mulatto, and then Chango being like this like dark-skinned, powerful man, right? But you might have somebody who doesn't have the same gender identity as a Orisha, that's a titular Orisha in their priesthood, or the racialized identities that we would like to engage the Orisha with, right? And so you'll have like a white person, a white man be a child of Yamaya, and you will bow down to that person in ceremony, in honor, because it's not them, it is the Orisha, right? And that troubles ideas around sexuality, around gender, around race, and around identity, right? And that's written about in Queering Black Afro-diasporic traditions. And so, yeah, it's just like I'm interested in the ways in which, again, like these things are troubled by our engagement with the divine, how they're depicted as Black, when they're depicted as Black, and also the engagement with nature that talks about the ways in which we're much more in a relationship with nature and understood by the divine as being no different from the animals and plants that we're engaging with us. I think that's what these traditions are also teaching us, that these things are important as much as we imbue meaning into them, but also there's another world that we have to engage with, and that's the world of the Orisha. And for the Orisha, we're a lot more equal in these spaces than sometimes we would like to talk about.
Thank you so much, and I love all your responses, and it really speaks to the power it has in not necessarily even being able to imagine the divine, but it being able to see them in front of you, whether it be in depictions or through the divine, like descending through a human host. I feel weird saying it that way, but I'm trying to be as general as I can for all the different practices that we're representing today. This does bring me, because when we're talking about how the divine are portrayed, it does bring me to the next question, which is scholarship discusses the racialization of religion oftentimes. So for example, you'll have Islam is racialized as Arab, Hinduism as South Asian. So would you argue that the religious system that you're representing today is racialized as a quote unquote Black religion? And do you agree? And what does the depiction of the divine as Black mean for non-Black adherents? And is there a space for non-Black adherents within the community as well?
This is a hot topic. I have lots of thoughts. It will be in the book after I get tenure.
Give us a taste.
But the taste is really important. And I think it's especially important because this is something that, again, both Rachel and Zabi are talking about and I really like Rachel's framing of this, the sort of proximity that one is granted as a white Brazilian or a white Cuban or a light-skinned Cuban or Brazilian in practicing the orishas or doing like a light version of it, right? There's a way in which one can be discriminated against and experience forms of religious racism. And there are also ways in which that access to Blackness and to Africanness grants one a certain cachet, a certain social capital. And that's a really interesting tension that, again, I think is just very different in the context of Haitian Vodou. Now, why this is interesting in Haitian Vodou is because you have a contemporary tradition that has reached Japan, France, not, I would say, quite as wide a scope as Rastafari, but interestingly, still a much broader tradition than its geographic boundaries of Haiti and its immediate Haitian diasporas that we would assume. I think that you're seeing larger populations of white North Americans and white Europeans, but really white North Americans coming from Canada and the United States initiating into Haitian Vodou. And I've written some articles about this because I find it fascinating. And my question was, well, how do white folks understand their place and their role in an African tradition? How do they understand their relationship to African spirits? And some of the things that emerged in my research, one is that the sites in which you see these white practitioners are not by coincidence. You see a lot of white devotees of Haitian Vodou in Boston, in Philadelphia, and in New York. What are some of the common populations of white folks in those three cities? Irish and Italians. What are the experiences of Irish and Italians with their racial identity in the United States? They wasn't always considered white. The Italians became white in the 1950s, we can say. The Irish became white in the 1930s, we could say. Jewish people also were regarded as being ethnic before the 1950s in the United States. And so I don't think it's a coincidence that you're seeing these marginalized or historically, let's be very clear, historically marginalized white folks in the United States who once used to be regarded as ethnic being attracted to othered religions practiced by people of color. But the thing specifically about the Irish and the Catholic is, sorry, the Irish and the Catholic, I'm saying my punchline here, the Irish and the Italian communities is that they're Catholic, right? And so a lot of people who identified with a Catholic upbringing, but who didn't feel like they belonged, searched for something else. And here I actually want to bring it to a question that's being asked in the chat about queerness. And I'm like chuckling because there's hope that there is more expansiveness for queerness because there are queer spirits in Haitian Vodou. You have spirits who are masculine, who are feminine, those who are gender fluid or gender androgynous, especially spirits of the water, such as Simbi, who has masculine and feminine forms and gender neutral forms, or gender androgynous, I should say. And then you also have queer spirits who engage in same-sex relations. Illuminato is a spirit who has male and female lovers, notably Simbi in masculine and feminine and androgynous forms. So that in and of itself, you cannot do the same damage of saying that there's no room for queer devotees when the spirits themselves embody more expansive understandings of gender identity and of sexual orientation. That is not to say there is no machismo in Haiti. That is not to say that every single Vodou temple is welcoming to queer devotees. However, it is to say that it would go against the core philosophical structures to actively disempower or disavow the fact that if somebody is queer in the Vodou tradition, there's queerness represented in divinity, right? And the reason that I say that is to tie it back to this question about white folks and folks who are not of African descent. A lot of white people who didn't feel at home in the Catholic Church are not feeling at home because they themselves are queer, or they themselves grew up working class, or they experience a certain form of physical disability or mental health challenge. For some reason, they didn't feel like they fit or they were welcomed in this Christian tradition. And coming to Vodou is a way for them to identify with a tradition where there are marginalized identities in the pantheon, queer spirits in the pantheon, those who are working class spirits in the pantheon, like Cousin Zaka, who labors in the field alongside devotees in jeans and gets his hands dirty in the earth, right? You have laboring spirits. And in addition to that, they feel like they can still honor their heritage. Because if their mother worshiped the Virgin, they can worship Yelzudi. If their father worshiped St. James, they can worship Ogu, right? Now, the reception of these white folks, I think, is more complicated. And at least in several houses that I've worked in, there are examples of people feeling like it's supposed to be a space of Black liberation, and how can we have white devotees in the house? There are other houses that are all white. I have major problems with that, who don't speak English, who don't speak French, who don't speak Haitian Creole, most importantly, which is the devotional language of Haitian Vodou. Let me end by saying this, which is, I think what's most important is if a house is going to be as gracious as to allow somebody who is not of African descent to enter in and to initiate, my own feelings put aside, if a house is going to be as gracious as to welcome somebody who's not of African descent, they need to be wholly deferential to Black people. That means that they need to be absolute freedom fighters for Black liberation. Point. That is your role as a white person. It is your role to know when to be quiet, and it is your role to know when to speak up and fight against oppression of Black people if you are in an African-derived tradition.
It's a powerful statement. Thank you for
that. And within Lukumi, you know, this is a conversation that became more widespread during the 2020 uprising. Just saw folks really pushing their elites, homes of ceremony, sacred homes, to really engage in which, to look at the ways in which they've engaged with anti-Blackness, despite folks being Black, folks being Black from different diasporic communities, like how they engage with anti-Blackness against other self-identified Black groups, and also those who are not Black, right? And the Risha will also check you around that. There is a priest who was checked by Obatala, which is the divinity of white, of the mountaintop, and he said, respect the people from which this tradition came from. So even the Orisha see this, right? So while I made the other statement around the Orisha challenging us and inviting us to see the ways in which we are more equal to not only other human beings, but also the land in which we're in, they also, again, understand the social, political, economic context in which we're in, and they presented themselves in a particular way. And these traditions are very much focused on ancestry and lineage, right? And so there was a question around like how ancestors are invoked or engaged with and honored, right? And so these are also initiatory traditions, right? And so this, so I'm gonna add a few complicated, maybe not complicated, or invitations to engage with. One, I find sometimes folks who are dabbling or engaging with these traditions, but have not made any initiations, have not initiated into the priesthood, really bothered when they see non-Black folks in these traditions, especially within ceremony, in which, like, again, when the divinities come down, you mobile, you go to the floor. It's like in such veneration of the Orisha, and depending which priesthood you're in, right? The priesthoods of the Fem Orisha of the water, right? The riverine divinities, or Yaoshun, Yamaya, there's a way that you go down to the floor. Other folks go down, head down to the floor in front of this person. So this dynamic in which you'll see a Black person going down to the floor to a person who is white, but again, the divinity is in there and it's in them, right? And it's to the Orisha, right? You do that also outside of so-called spirit possession, right? You do that based on the eldership of the priests, right? And so I will mobile it to a person who may be white, who was initiated 20 years ago because they were my elder in the tradition. It's based on the years of initiation. And so is also an invitation to those who have not made that commitment, because these are commitments to the Orisha. And these are commitments to again, like that's why I started off with La Regla de Ocha, the rules of Ocha. And they're not easy rules to go by. These ceremonies are days long. And so, and this is a guidebook for your life. And so if you really made that commitment, then there's also certain regulations you will follow outside, not outside, we can never be outside of race and racialization. Race is endemic, of course, in the society, and we should understand that, but you'll have these dynamics and people will question these dynamics. And sometimes, like, we have to let folks know who have made these commitments, like, this is important what you're saying, but also, like, have you made this commitment? Because I will respect a white devotee or a non-Black devotee who's a priest, right? But also challenge them on their own racism. And we have to hold those things side by side. We do. And that's like that's the invitation, I believe, of the Orisha, invitation of God, to how can we strive to build community through conflict, right? And you also have, we also, again, like honoring ancestors in terms of the priesthoods, right? You have the Egungun priesthood in Yorubaland, the priesthood devoted to worshiping and honoring the ancestors. And that is seen as a part, integrated in a larger system of devotion, but as a part, their own temples, their own priesthood, right? And it's said that you have to focus, you may have been a priest of the Orisha, we have to focus on Egun, right? That priesthood as a complete system that exists in Yorubaland did not survive all throughout diaspora. It did in the island of Itaparica. I went to that ceremony in Itaparica, Bahia this summer. It was beautiful to see the way we say preserved and transformed the Egungun priesthood. But you have a filtering of the imagery and of the devotion of that in Cuba and its diasporas and other Caribbean diasporas. So again, like the depiction of the Orisha, when you have the sacred item, you see the sacred items of the Orisha, right? And some of them you receive through different initiatory segments and towards the priesthood, right? In Cuba and in its diaspora, you put them in soperas, right? And that also speaks to the engagement of Chinese labor communities in Cuba, right? And so again, you have this engagement, cross-continental engagement happening through these religious traditions, and through the anniversary of your initiation or other ceremonies, you will cover those soperas with cloth, right? And it almost gives, and you have like this semi-human kind of aspect to that. But you can reference that to the ways in which the Egungun priesthood is depicted, because the idea is that there's no person under these costumes, right? It's a spirit, right? And so that depiction looks almost the same. And so while the Egungun priesthood didn't survive, the ways in which they're engaging with the Orisha, depictions of the Orisha, depiction of like otherworldly entities has filtered into Cuba and this diaspora. And so you have like the songs, you also have like different ceremonies in which you worship the dead that's very similar to that exists in Yoruba land now today, as well as some of the songs that were very similar in Bahia. And then I lost my train of thought, because it's important to talk about these as like initiatory traditions with different priesthoods, different ways to honor ancestors and the Orisha, separate but also interconnected, and ways in which like our understandings of race and identity troubles that, and we have to engage with that. And also, this is the most important point. This is about ancestors. We don't know where all our ancestors came from. Human beings have been migrating across the globe for millennia. And so I also think, like, when I see folks who are not Black engaging with Lukumi, that they may be, and this is like through our engagement with other systems, right, that honor the dead, like Espiritismo, right, which is one way that the Egungun priesthood filtered and transformed and translated into diaspora, right, as a way is to validate these traditions that were being oppressed by this elite that was engaging with like spiritism, right. That's also one of the reasons that white folks were allowed to initiate in these communities as a way to say, like, this is that we can no longer suffer this oppression in these particular ways. This allows some white folks in this tradition as a way to survive, a strategy to survive, right? And then again, this conversation, like, has it gone too far? That's part of the conversation in the community. But that was a strategy by Black folks in order to preserve, transform these traditions from state-sanctioned oppression, right? And so you have Espiritismo, like in those ceremonies, you talk to the dead. You find out like your spiritual lineages, you find out like traditions and ancestry that you never thought existed, right? And sometimes you'll have folks who had African ancestors that they did not know they had. So I see a lot of indigenous folks, a lot of Mexican American folks engaging in traditions, and for me that's speaking to what is now being more researched upon is like speaking to the fact that these migrations and the trafficking of African peoples also happen in Mexico. And so folks have African ancestry that is pushing them towards these traditions, because some of these indigenous traditions have been eradicated or filtered through other spaces and synchronized with other traditions. It's one way for our ancestors to say, okay, like, we would like you to get engaged in some tradition that is devoted to our ancestry, devoted to like respecting the land and nature, and also devoted to the spirits of nature, right? And so that's also a strategy I think our ancestors are employing, and that's why we're seeing, and that's a more spiritual perspective in terms of why we're seeing so many non-Black folks in these traditions, aside from like capitalism, commodification, and strategies for survival and perseverance across time.
I'd like, there are like such beautiful overlaps happening. So I want to just jump in right now, because this question was making me think about racialization in relation to colorism, which is also something I'm very interested in and I teach a course on, and bringing up Oshun and Ezili as the mulat, Oshun as Beyonce, like just brought all of the colorism things to mind that I wanted to talk about. So, you know, like the Orishas are not, and the Loa are not outside the realm of colorism in all of our systems of privilege and discrimination, right? And so I do think it's interesting that it's the divinity who is linked to beauty, feminine beauty, who is lighter skin, right? And Dr. Daniels pointed out, right, that it is the female divinity who's linked to being strength, a warrior who has the darkest shade of skin. You know, I think it's so complicated in Brazil. Like Afro-Brazilian religion, Umbanda, Candomblé has people of all different types of skin tone, hair texture. But I would say, like, we know they're Afro-Brazilian, however, and this goes back also to what you were saying, Dr. Burgos, is like, we know that they're Black because the spiritists, who are mostly Euro-Brazilian, are not under fire and being violently accosted in the same way that Candomblé, Umbanda, and Kimbanda practitioners, whether dark skin or lighter skin, are. So that's saying to me, right, it's not really about spirits. It's not really about Christianity. It might more so be about the racialization aspect in relation to not being Abrahamic and not being a Christian religion. Because Spiritism also exists in Brazil and is quite popular there. So I wanted to just say too, like, it's complicated because colorism is happening simultaneously to this, to mestizaje in Brazil and in other parts of Latin America and the Caribbean as well. Brazil is one of the places, like Mexico, right, and Puerto Rico as well, that it has a national mythology of mixedness, right? Which means that Brazilians, no matter how phenotypically white they might look, right, can say like, well, I'm Brazilian, so I have African heritage, whether that's true and they know about it, true and they don't know about it, not true at all, right? Everybody can access Blackness. And as Dr. Daniels was saying, it's very, there are convenient ways to access and approximate oneself to Blackness that can give you a certain cachet, especially in the realm of music. There are all of these, I love the gossip, right? Like African derived religion gossip in the Americas is the best, right? So in Brazil, it's like all the pop stars, they're like, oh, you know, so-and-so is initiated. Yeah. I hear she's the daughter of Iemanjá, like Ivete Sangalo, you know, and it's like white women, white pop stars. And so again, like there's this way in which many Brazilians access and can create more proximity to Blackness through Afro-Brazilian religion, but also are beneficiaries of colorism, right? Like, so they're protected a bit more in their proximity to Africanness, right? They're protected from Afrophobia in a way. And that's real. But I also want to respect the idea that, no, it's true. Like Brazil is a place in which the majority of people are African descended, but that looks very in many different ways. And so many people feel a strong connection to the Orishas, a strong connection to Afro-Brazilian religion. And historically speaking too, Euro-Brazilians have been a part of Candomblé because it was a space, a safe space to talk about socialism, to have, right, queer solidarity. So again, when I go back to saying how Candomblé is Black and Blackness, a Black worldview includes these elements that are queer, that are anti-capitalist, that are anti-misogynist, right? Historically, it has also been a space in which people for different types of liberation movements have gathered, and those people were sometimes Euro-Brazilians, sometimes middle-class Brazilians, and you still see that represented in the terreiros or temples in contemporary Brazil.
Okay, good. I'll add that Rastafari in Jamaica is understood as a Black people's religion that is accepting of non-Black identified people if they accept the following tenets. So one is that they accept Emperor Selassie, Haile Selassie I, as the Messiah or as God. So that's one. The second one is that they accept the tenet of what many of the older Rastas would call Black redemption, that is repatriation to Africa, that is leaving Babylon, leaving the West to go to Africa, to return to Africa, to go home to Africa, I should say. And a third I would add is to accept and endorse Black liberation. So generally speaking, those are sort of tenets that allow people who are not necessarily identified as Black to identify as a part of the religious system. But you have to sort of put that in a generational context. So if we look at the first generation of Rastas, there were Indian Rastas. You know, there was a population of people from the subcontinent of India, and some of them were among that first generation of Rasta people, right? By the time we get to the third generation now, we have brown Jamaicans, brown being the kind of, you know, offspring of Black and white folk, the children of Black and white folk. That's a racial category in Jamaica, brown, who were becoming Rastas. But brown folk, for the most part, not totally, were of middle-class status. And that many of these people were becoming Rasta was quite a stir and quite a problem for the establishment. But by that third generation now, you also have Chinese Rastas. This is in Jamaica. By the fourth generation, you know, you have Rastas all over the world. You know, I've met Japanese Rastas, I've met white Rastas, you know, there are Rasta communities in New Zealand, in Thailand, you know, and so it's really become a global faith. And as has become a global faith, these different communities kind of adapted to their own needs. So I would say, first and foremost, especially for Jamaica, it is understood as a Black religion, but it is accepting of other people if they embrace these tenets that I shared with you.
We need some more tenets like these in Haitian Vodou. Right on, my brother. Thank you so much, Elder.
Yeah. All right, actually, that does bring me to the final question. Wait, do we have enough time for it? Okay, we do. I want to also leave some space for some questions, so let's just keep that in mind with the responses. But there has been an increasing contemporary interest and shift among Afro-diasporic people from institutionalized Abrahamic faiths to Afro-Atlantic religious systems. Why do you think that is?
So I don't have an answer. I actually said to myself, I don't have an answer to this, but I will conjecture that one of the things that I've noticed, certainly among Rasta people and younger Rastas, is that people have access to information. Like there's a marketplace of information out there that just didn't even exist when I was younger, like when I was in my 20s, right? I mean, if I had to go to the library, and most of the libraries that I went to weren't good. You know, they didn't have very much stuff. So it was really hard to acquire information. And now a lot of it is at your fingertips. It's, you know, it's your keyboard, your phone, whatever. So I think part of what has changed is that there's just so much easier access to things that are not common knowledge that people can explore in ways that they couldn't, you know, 2 generations ago. So that's my conjecture.
I mean, it's okay if you don't have an answer for the question. We can open it up if you like to the audience. Because I know
Oh,
there
no,
was a
I got
little bit
thoughts. I was just trying not to dominate the conversation, but I got thoughts.
Okay, go.
Go ahead, Dr. Cantave.
No, we probably have similar thoughts. I was going to say, it'll be very quick. I do notice, and I'm interested in the students that come to my Africana and Afrophobia religions class who are encountering all of these traditions we're talking about through Instagram, through social media, and the way that people are able to kind of cherry pick between them. Maybe Dr. Jennings, you have more thoughts on this. I do think like digital engagement with the traditions is something I would like us to talk about.
Bobby, did you want to go? And then I'll conclude before we open it up. No? Okay. Well, I'll say, yeah, I have so many thoughts about this. And first of all, I'll say that my students and my sister friends and my brother friends know this about me. I'm low-key always proselytizing in my Africana religions classes. Always. Always. And it's for very intentional reasons. You know, this generation, myself, I identify as a millennial, and the generation that follows, Gen Z, you know, a lot of us in these younger generations and the older generations as well identify with this spiritual but not religious category. And I don't think it's because they don't want to connect to the divine or they don't feel a strong desire to have a religious community. Rather, it's because they haven't felt welcomed in the institutionalized systems of oppression that call themselves monotheistic religions. And let me be very clear here that I am not saying that all of the forms of Judaism or all of the forms of Christianity or all the forms of Islam are inherently oppressive, but people manipulate these religions to be so, right? And that is especially the case, of course, we know with Christianity and its damning effects on the subjugation and oppression of African and African descendant peoples. So I think because there are so much trauma, quite frankly, from these experiences with these traditions saying that if you don't look like this, RY Jesus, if you don't act like this straight all the time, if you don't behave in this type of fashion, sexually prude, you know, never cursing, all of these things, no drinking, no smoking, then you don't belong here and there's no salvation for you. I think what happens in these classrooms and in these conversations like the ones we're having is that these African traditions are demystified, right? They're humanized, they're given depth, they're given dimension. People are able to see themselves in a Black divine, well, God come black, right? They're able to envision what it means to be a part of a community where the divine looks like us and has room essentially for all, as long as we're all fighting for Black liberation, right? And that's so powerful. That's so empowering. That's transformative. I think, I see Dr. Nathalie Piel, who's here and asking such a thoughtful question, which Dr. Cantave began to answer. I do think we want to be cautious about the ways that, people can commercially profit from these Africana traditions. But truthfully, I still feel like there's so much misinformation out there about how these religious traditions are demonic. I mean, I just played a clip for my students today from The Princess and the Frog. We got friends on the other side. I mean, this is what our communities are being taught about what African religions are, that they are the devil, right? And so I think any work to undo that learning is part of liberatory work. And that includes, our Judenas, whom I went to college with, by the way. That includes our Judenas who are making, silly videos like Sufi woman and like kind of exotifying these traditions. But perhaps if that's an entry point into really talking about how these traditions have room for all of us, then I'll take it. I'll take it, and I'll be grateful for the opportunity to kind of push things further, because how do we get people to understand that these are tools of liberation, that these Africana religions do have powers to, uplift us and unite us as Pan-African systems? Because that's really what they are. These are deeply Pan-African systems because they're drawing from multiple African lineages. We educate, right? And that's through conversations. That's through honest dialogue and conversations and the unlearning of these colonial mindsets. So let's open it up.
I have one thing in terms of that. I think since we have so many depictions, demonizing depictions, and so much of these traditions have been used to enforce these demonized perceptions, right? So that even the conceptualization, the Eurocentric conceptualization of the dead and engagement with the dead, right? Again, like the dead and Lukumi is part of the everyday experience of living in this world, right? Your ancestors are speaking with you, not only in ceremony, not only in ritual, but they're right by you all the time. They're right by me right now, right? And that's not just a belief, that's part of being part of these systems, right? And part of being part of this tradition and continuing these traditions and transforming them. But you invoke the dead, all these images of fear, again, perpetuated by the media, perpetuated by stories. And again, like these traditions were used in order to develop these depictions, right? Like the source of these depictions are these traditions, right? When we talk about the witch hunts, we have to talk about the ways in which people were burned by the stake across the Americas through multiple inquisitions, right? And so folks are leaving Christianity and other Abrahamic traditions because they want to have a different relationship with their ancestors and ancestry, right? And these traditions, that's embedded, right? Your engagement, your ancestors, respect for your ancestors, right? Honoring your ancestors from all the spaces they came from. I wanted to return to these traditions because, as I mentioned, and it wasn't just my great-grandparents, I mean, it's like so many different Afro-Caribbean traditions that my family has engaged with historically. And I say that humbly, not because, I'll get to that in terms of why that also is a focal point of tension within these traditions. When people who are leaving area traditions come into Lukumi, it's like, who has more credence to talk about these traditions? Who has ancestral claims to traditions? Who have national claims to these traditions? And I don't want to go, and I don't like to go in that because all I can say, I'm Dominican and Puerto Rican, devotees from both sides, and Maroons from both sides, African peoples who engage with indigenous peoples, right, on both sides, and who had to transform a system through oral traditions, through music, through adornment, through the most horrific state-sanctioned oppression that we can imagine, right? I want to honor them. And so there's reasons why certain family members converted to Pentecostalism, like the Temple Espirituales, in which like on both sides of my family developed in Puerto Rico, like are now abandoned, and people went into mass to Pentecostalism. So you also see that migration from leaving these African traditions and Afro-diasporic traditions into Christianity, right? That's the experience of my grandmother. She didn't want to be a Spiritista. She converted to Catholicism in the 1950s, right? And so, but still kept aspects of Espiritismo, right? A candle is always lit to the ancestors. at home, right? So I also want to honor that. This is a personal choice someone made to go the other way, but still can never give up their ancestors, right? So for me, it's like I wanted I and my mother wanted to go back to these traditions that, again, practically skipped one generation in some ways, right? Because of our Blackness, because of our pride of like the histories in which our people have survived and transformed and persevered, and because Blackness in Puerto Rico and in DR is subjugated in many ways by the state, right? But people, the everyday people, working class people, the descendants of maroon societies, are challenging the state and challenging their neighbors to engage and challenging ourselves, right? Anti-Blackness is something that we have all internalized, that we have to do work to decolonize, right? And these traditions is one way for that to happen as part of that process, right? There's the other part. Let's not romanticize them. Like I said, folks come into these traditions, and then it's like, who has this claim? Who's affirming this claim? And some people do, right? That these Caribbean nations have fought to decolonize themselves, and we can question whether they have decolonized. Like changing imperial hands is not a decolonizing process all the time either. And so you have like this national affirmation that comes somewhere. We can't negate that either. There's a reason why there's a strong sense of Cuban nationalism, right? Because of U.S. occupation and U.S. oppression. Same thing in Puerto Rico, and the same thing in Santo Domingo, right? And so we have to engage while some of these folks who are Black identified and will be Black identified in those contexts, right, are seeing themselves as part of a national group, and when they come to the United States. So we have to engage why that happens, and how we have across ethnic coalitions and conversations about that, right? It's about U.S. occupation, it's about U.S. oppression. And so Afro-Cubans, Afro-Puerto Ricans are coming to the United States and seeing themselves as part, closer to a group that they may not feel closest to and back in their homelands because of like the legacies of this country in those spaces, right? And they see that reproduced in their relationships in their communities in the United States, right? And so when folks come into these traditions, you have to contend with that historical reality that is not really spoken about in the scholarship as much as I would like it to be spoken about, right? When we talk about Blackness and anti-Blackness from the Caribbean, and then I go into the space in which like who has this claim, and like folks assume like because my family's from the Caribbean, and again I was born and raised in New York City and lived in Chicago half my life, it's like I have a greater claim to it, and then I invoke the history that I invoked, and it's like it's complicated, just like it's complicated in the United States. It's complicated throughout the world because of colonialism, because of anti-race, because of racism and colonization, and so again, like there's a lot of debate around that, and so who to support? Again, initiatory societies, like so when you are in these traditions and initiated into these traditions, right? There's a certain protocol you have to follow, right? And it's not like as if there's no patriarchy or racism or classism. That's embedded still. That's embedded in some of the old traditions, right? Some of these divinities, some of them reshared their stories of their historical stories of them being kings and queens, obas and alafins in empires, right? They had conflict with other groups, and those oral traditions are passed down and filtered down, and sometimes like that you see them play out in terms of like debates between Lukumi and La Regla de Congo, for example, right? It's like the wars between the Congo peoples and Yoruba land play out in terms of our relationships within community too. And so like you have all this taking place. It's I tell folks, when it comes to these traditions, you have to understand the histories, understand the oral tradition, and also understand that these debates are happening and people are challenging them, but people also have internalized them.
Okay, thank you all so much for that. I don't mean to rush this off, but I do want to get to some of the questions that people ask, unless any of you have something that you want to add.
I have a burning desire to ask Dr. Cantave to please illuminate for us on religious racism, because y'all need to know that religious racism is a concept that comes out of Brazil, and there's two people in the US that I know that are theorizing on it right now. One is Dr. Danielle Boaz, and one is Dr. Rachel Cantave, and I am waiting for the books and the articles. But can we ask you to give us a little bit more context, because we have to talk about religious racism in conversation with anti-Blackness. So please and thank you.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I was just typing a response to someone in the chat, but I think what's important to note about religious racism, so let me see the name actually. Zaid put a comment in the chat about a recent murder of a Mãe de Santo in Brazil. And so I bring that up to say the term religious racism comes from povos de santo and anti-racist activists in Brazil who have been using it and proposing it in relation to religious intolerance. So rather than talking about violence against Afro-Brazilian religions or African-derived religions in the as religious intolerance, to instead refer to them as religious racism. Why? Well, because religious intolerance, for one, makes it seem as if violence against these traditions is a one-off or like an individual act, rather than something that is systematic, something that is structural, something that is part of our broader concept of racism. So in Brazil, when we think about religious racism, it's not just the fact that temples are being burned down, which they are. People are being physically displaced from their neighborhoods, which they are. Mothers are losing custody of their children for practicing Afro-Brazilian religions, which they are. And many other things. I could go on and on, the different types of religious racism that people are suffering there. But it's that this is happening simultaneous to the policing and militarization of Afro-Brazilian favelas, the displacement of Afro-Brazilian people for things like the World Cup, the removing of land rights from quilombos, so the maroon communities that we talked about earlier in this conversation. And so religious racism, talking about religious racism allows us to see this as a core part of structural racism. So if we're going to talk about decolonizing Latin America and the Caribbean, if we're going to talk about doing the work of dismantling racism, we have to pay attention to how religious racism operates as well. And like I was saying, right, religious racism is the fact that Afro-Brazilian religions are going through all of this, but the spiritists aren't having their temples burnt down. They're not having to talk about whether or not they're actually a real religion. They're not having to worry about losing their job for wearing a religious clothing to work, right? So that's the idea of religious racism. And I do think it's really good for us to start to have this conversation in tandem with Brazilian scholars, many of whom are practitioner scholars, who are at the forefront of coming up with this concept and using this terminology.
Merci à vous.
Thank you. Let me go to I think I can add people. Barbara, are you available to ask your question live? I'm just gonna add you and we'll see what happens. No, she left. All right, so, oh no, she's there, yes. Okay, allowed to talk. Hello.
Hola.
Hey, Barbara, oh my God.
Hi, Sabi. Thank you for this amazing panel, Omar. Listening to all of you, I've been like here, like learning and unlearning a lot of things, and I want to learn more. And my question, I was thinking, is this a good question or is a respectful question? The one that I put on the chat, because I was thinking is there a safe space for people like me that we don't know enough about these kind of traditions, but we want to honor our ancestors, etc.? That's what I asked. If you as scholars, if you find the perpetuation of anti-Black racism, sexism, and other isms in these traditions that some of you, I know that you practice, but also you study this system of religious. So this is my question, and also for you, Dr. Cantave and Dr. Daniels, as non-white women, being scholars in these religions that we all know that a lot of men have been studying religions and non-Black men. So this is just two questions that I know probably you don't need to answer now, but it's just my curiosity. Thank you, Omar.
Can I say something? You know, because Dr. Resach, I know you study Bomba, and so you probably have seen a lot of the ways in which like Bomba communities are engaging with Afro-diasporic spiritualities, particularly Lukumi, right? And so again, as I mentioned, like Lukumi is a lot of that Ocha. Lukumi is a liturgical language that's easier to say than a lot of that Ocha. Is Afro-Cuban, right? But there's a Cuban diaspora in Puerto Rico, right? And usually the historiography of these traditions says that that took place after the Cuban Revolution in 1959. But there were Puerto Rican and Cuban migrant workers and socialist workers and pro-independence workers and activists like since the 19th century. So actually, I would say that that's been that integration of like Afro-Cuban Lukumi in Puerto Rican communities in Puerto Rico and the diaspora have been happening for almost a century. And so I see that play out in these Bomba communities. Bomba is an Afro-Puerto Rican musical form, right? And so I think is a way in which Bomba has been despiritualized, right? And so it's seen as like part of that now is like the cultural affirmation of Blackness in Puerto Rico, but there's also like become a national cultural affirmation also. And so again, like that has been spoken about in debates and in engagements and opinions about it. But Barbara, there's always a house of somebody, right? But knowing that sometimes you will face sexism and racism and homophobia and transphobia. It depends on the house you're engaging with and how many people in that house are challenging that. So I have spoken to devotees who like, my house is pro-Black, but it's homophobic as hell, right? And the other folks are like, I have a lot of racist, anti-Black folks in my house, but it's like very, very much like femme-centric, right? That happens. So you have to do the work, and your ancestors will always help you do that work. And so, you know, we can talk more about that, but thank you so much for your question.
Thank you.
What are you waiting for? You know,
Hi, sorry. I was like, is someone else going to jump in? I'm not sure. I just need a little bit of more clarification about the question that you asked us, but is it specific to a sort of history of white men being the ones primarily who have studied these religious traditions? And you wanted to know what our experience is being researchers in these traditions is like now, is that it?
Yes, just in general, that in terms of publications, it's hard for us as a Black woman to publish and for our committee sometimes to feel that our topics are good enough or academic enough, etc. But for other people, that is not a question.
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. So I'll speak specific to myself. I think actually as a PhD student, I probably went the comparative route a little bit subconsciously because feeling like that, sort of understanding that if I took a comparative approach to looking at religion in Brazil, religion and race in Brazil, that my research would be more palatable, perhaps. I am happy though, ultimately, that I took that approach because I think there was a lot that I learned through having conversations about race and religion with Catholics and neo-Pentecostals. I didn't, because I did comparative religion, I'm ultimately now in the place where I'm thinking a lot about religious racism. I'm not sure I would have such an interesting entry point to that conversation had I not also spent a lot of time with Black evangelicals and neo-Pentecostals who told me about why they don't trust the Candomblé across the street, right? And in relation to actually doing the work, I have had interactions with white researchers, anthropologists, who have asked me, how did you get access in Brazil with these different populations? And I think it's, talking about the Pan-Africanism of the Haitian revolution and everything, there's a way that, I showed up in Brazil and people were like, oh, this is so fascinating. Like, tell me about your familial religious background, and embraced me, and we bonded through our Blackness, our mutual Blackness, right? In a way that I think a lot of white scholars, especially now, struggle to get those types of, to forge those kinds of relationships in the field in places like Brazil that have been so overexposed to like white extractive anthropological research, historically speaking.
I want to take this opportunity to answer a question being posed by Mumbo Dr. Khadija Monet Martin. It's so good to see you, sis. Thank you for joining, and shout out to so many of you who are showing love in the chat. We appreciate y'all. I want to answer this question about how we can try to strive for more social harmony in our communities. And I think it's such an important question and a challenging one because a lot of our energy is expended doing defensive work, right? I mean, Dr. Cantave is talking about the fact that these are not small matters. These are questions of life and death at times. I mean, following the earthquake, many of you would probably be familiar in Haiti, following the 2010 earthquake and more recently the 2021 earthquake, Pat Robertson, this televangelist, went on live television and said, you know, the reason that Haiti has experienced this earthquake is because of a pact that they made with the devil in 1791. And of course, what he's referring to is the sacred pact that people made with their spirits to fight for freedom and Black emancipation. This is something that Dr. Cantave was speaking about earlier. It is so important that we recognize that the work fighting against religious racism and fighting against anti-Blackness is essential, but we cannot expend all of our energy doing this deeply, deeply exhausting work of always defending. We also have to do things to uplift ourselves. And here I really have to give a shout out to my Ibeji, my Magasa, Dr. Funayo Wood, who has been an absolute trailblazer in creating Ashe Ire community and communiversity specifically, creating systems and institutions to teach our people, our communities, the truths about these traditions, creating Black Spirit solstice summits, creating retreats. I mean, let's be very clear. White folks have been making money off of other people's religions forever. I mean, white Buddhist retreats, white yoga retreats. This is part of the yoga industrial complex. I call this part of the voodoo industrial complex, right? It's just like making money off of our traditions. We should be able to create these things for ourselves. And, you know, in thinking about, you know, just things that we can learn from other traditions, I'll speak specifically about Vodou. I love that, you know, in Benin, there's a National Vodou Day, January 10th, which incidentally is my mother's birthday, right? I love that in the African diaspora in the United States, there are Egungun festivals, there are Oshun festivals. What's really nice about that is that it means everyone from all houses and all temples within a community are welcome to come and attend. We don't have that in Vodou. We know about the structural religious racism that we experience in Haiti and why that may not be possible politically, but why not in the diaspora? And I think that there are those like, you know, Riva Presil, who is doing really exciting and important work, you know, to try to make public festivals into things that are accessible. They're not exactly ceremonies, but they're opportunities for people to try to come and contribute. I think that we could learn a lot from having opportunities to bring multiple houses together. There's so much distrust in our communities because of colonial histories of violence, because of contemporary experiences of selling people out, reporting people to the police, denigrating those publicly and privately who belong to African traditions. I think that we have, in addition to the defensive work, if we can start doing work to uplift, that I think will be a really powerful way forward.
So much for that. We have time for one more. Actually, I'm gonna ask Katie if you're available to ask your question. But if not, let me see if there's another one I can ask. Sorry, I'm going through the chat. There's a lot of questions here. KTHMC, are you available? Let me see if I can find you in the chat. 1 second. Okay. If you could unmute and ask your question, if you'd like.
Am I unmuted?
Yes.
Hi, my name is Kimberly Thomas McNair. I am a lecturer in AAAS,
Hmm.
and I did have a question. This has been a great panel, and my question involves how the panelists have observed African spiritual and religious practices being embraced in activist communities, and that's activist communities in a political sense is beyond just faith communities as we understand them, especially given the uptick in global uprisings around Black Lives Matter and diasporic struggles around immigration and anti-Black racism globally. And this includes places like Brazil, as well as places like Nazareth, in the Holy Land, et cetera. So I like to know, what have you observed in this sense?
That's such a wonderful question. I'm going to give a very, very brief answer in the context of the United States. Hoodoo has always been a part of rebellion and activism. And these traditions all have deep political roots as Pan-Africanist systems. But especially in the Black Lives Matter movement, you have a lot of people from the Hoodoo and root work communities, even from African diaspora traditions like Lukumi, like Vodou, who are doing prayer work, who are uplifting those who have died, who are creating altars for those who have been murdered senselessly. I think that that's really important work, in addition to protesting by walking in the streets, in addition to, creating legislation, and in addition to marching, like work to hold people down spiritually, to provide amulets, to provide, protective prayers and blessings. That's very important work that's already happening.
So I'll add that one of the places that a lot of people are placing attention as far as Rastafari goes is the prison system. A lot of Rastas find their faith in the prison systems. And I've worked for many years with chaplains of different prisons to, quote, educate, provide religious instruction, but to do much more, to literally do political education, because in federal prisons, you can't really do political education. So we've had to find ways to kind of mask providing the kinds of information that many of the captives want to learn. So that's one thing. I think another is advocating for legal recognition of one's practices and rights. So, serving as an expert witness to say, okay, these prisoners want to recognize these as holy days. How can you, as a bureaucracy, recognize their practices and their rights and meet their religious needs under your bureaucratic institutions? So for Rastas, the prison complex is a real concern, and there's a lot of work that's going on around the prison industrial complex.
Thank you so much for your question, Kim. I want to be cognizant of the time difference, because I know on the East Coast, where 3 of our presenters are in, it's 10 p.m. I don't want to go much longer. I do want to thank you all so much for coming together for this panel. It means so much to me, because I literally have my mentor, 2 of my colleagues from the studies, and then now a student that I'm working with in the university that I'm now a postdoctoral fellow in. So this is a beautiful moment for me, but also I hope for all of you as well. And thank you all so much again. This has been recorded, should be posted, I believe, on the AAAS website or YouTube. And again, thank you all so much for joining us. I hope it's been as wonderful for you all as it has been for me.
Can we have just one final word? There's a question here that I feel like really, really is so powerful. And an anonymous attendee asked, how might Black Christians who are not Christian supremacists come alongside practitioners of other Black diaspora traditions as partners and siblings? Honey child, I don't know who you are, but thank you for that question. And thank you for posing that. I think in the same way that when we have Black Lives Matters movements, we need white folks on the front lines so that Black folks are not being beaten senseless. In the same way that queer folks need straight folks out on the front lines, we need our Black Christian brothers, sisters, and siblings on the front lines with us. Come to ceremony. ask to have interfaith dialogues with us. Bring us to your churches, bring us to your synagogues, bring us to your mosques, so that we can have conversations and talk about like really pushing forward a Pan-Africanist and a Black liberation agenda together. Like in Haitian Creole, we say, many hands make the load light. So I bobo and ashe for that. Thank you for that question. And thank you so much again, Dr. Ramadan-Santiago, for organizing. This has been magnificent.
So glad. Thank
Thank
you all.
you, everyone.
All right. Everyone take care. Have a good night, everyone.